You don't, you see, whoever's trying to cover it up, obviously whoever was responsible for the whole thing, are still at their games. But what they haven't realised, those people, is that by covering up truth, you only damage the body politic more and more. Eventually we have to find the truth out on this planet about these events, so please don't kill any more, you know. We need these truth speakers to come forward. Don't kill them, you know. Okay, and then finally I come to part 4, which is an important part of this book, where I look at a whole series of hypotheses as to who might have done it. I'm doing my forensic historian thing, and I list, you know, for instance, was it, I mean, one possibility, and I'm just, you know, reading a few here, some people say the building had been wired, but there are also directed energy weapons involved. Some say the buildings were internally wired by the owner of the building, Silverstein, who had only recently acquired the buildings for insurance purposes. You know, that's another thing that's never been properly investigated. It's possible. Others say that some other foreign power was involved, not US, but it was like another foreign power. China, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and I explore all of those possibilities. Another possibility, it was American rogue intelligence unit that, influenced by the neocons, the extreme right behind the Bush administration, wanted it to be justified as launching wars in the Middle East. Look, they attacked us, let's attack them, kind of thing. And again, there's evidence, because the people that immediately went to war against Iraq were all those people. The Project for a New American Century, they were called. So I explore all these hypotheses. There's about 20 of them in that section. I'm not going to go into all the details. And then finally, in part 5, the end of the book, and this, by the way, you know, you can see why it took me 2 years to write, okay? I then ask as a philosopher, because I've got 2 hats in this book. I'm asking as a historian, I'm also asking as a philosopher, and I say, what are the moral and philosophical questions that arise from all that? I mean, they're huge. And so, again, I talk about the silence of the philosophers. I mean, having said which, there have been a few philosophers who've looked at this problem. One of them is my late colleague Ted Hondrich, who's professor of philosophy at UCL, who wrote a book about 9/11, ethically, you know. And there are a few other philosophers who've looked at these issues. And since I run Philosophers and Historians of Peace, obviously, you know, it's my job to ask those philosophical questions, which I do in this final chapter. And, you know, it's a huge work. That's why it took me 2 years. Okay.
All right, seems interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
And if we want to access the book, or maybe you will tell that later, then...
No, I can tell people now. I mean, well, I will give a free copy to anyone that's a really close friend or helper. You'll get a free copy later today. And you can get it on my publishing website. I prefer to publish my stuff on, it's a wonderful international, you know, website which you can download either as an electronic copy, or you can order the hardback.
Right.
It's softback. It's on print on demand thing. And if you go to www.lulu.com/IPSGP, the acronym of my institute, so that's IPSGP, then you can see it up there.
Great.
And you know, you can get it winged to your you know, address wherever you are in the world. Yeah, so that's how you get access to the book.
Good to know.
Yeah.
And you also wrote a second volume, is that correct? And can you tell us a little more about shortly what it contains?
Okay, so I thought originally I'd stick with the first volume and that would be enough. I mean, that was a huge work. That's nearly 500 pages, just volume 1 alone. But then I'm one of those Herculean thinkers that I never do things by halves. I do things like 2 or 3 times more than I need to. I'm not a minimalist. And like in my PhD thesis, it was 100,000 words of thesis and then another 100,000 of appendices. And so with this thing, I stuck in a huge appendix, which turned out to be as big as the original volume. And I think it was worth doing, and I think it's quite important. What it is, if I can find it on here, is a... bear with me, where's it gone? Right.
Is it a sequence on the volume 1, or is it something completely different?
No, it follows. What I wanted to ask was, because that first volume deals with the run-up, the immediate events of the day and so on. Well, that was 18 years ago. And I'm a contemporary historian. Like, that was my field of study at my degree at the University of London and my PhD. And contemporary history is really interesting and difficult because there's always more history happening every day, if you're a contemporary historian. And so I wanted to look at the history of responses to 9/11, because that also tells us something about the events. So who subsequently has been speaking out, and what have they been saying? You know, so I've done a sort of, I call it the history of responses to 9/11, right? And first chapter is the history of responses in the Middle East.
And is it the responses of politicians or?
Mostly politicians, but also wherever I can find them, academics and intellectuals, wherever they've managed to speak out. And I've done it on a country-by-country basis. So the one on the Middle East, there's a chapter on Jordan. So the King of Jordan, what did he say at the time? What did he say on the day? What did he say since then? What have Jordanian intellectuals done? Well, in his case, he's done a lot of interfaith peace work. You know, the guy's a bit of a living saint, in my opinion. Jordan has been tremendously trying to heal this conflict. Then I've gone and looked at what Kuwait has said, what Lebanon has said, what Qatar, and also what the Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union, many of them were Islamic, what they've said, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. And I've looked at all the Emirates, the Arab Gulf states, and the Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. And I've gone into what, you know, the rulers of the states have said, but also if they've had any, you know, inquiries of their own. Then I look at the history of other regions, Iraq. I mean, all these countries, like Iraq, said they had nothing to do with it. Saddam Hussein, who was ruling Iraq at the time, sent his commiserations to the American people. Correct formal diplomatic protocol. Yeah, he obviously had nothing to do with it because he was utterly opposed to everything Al-Qaeda stood for. He was a secular Muslim who believed in interfaith tolerance within the Iraqi state. They had Christians, Baha'is, etc. in high office. His prime minister was a Christian, Tariq Aziz. Like, what? You don't read that on the East News, you know. So, anyway, I go into all that. I go into the response by Syria, which again sent commiserations. Iran, you know, demonized by the West, and yet it sent commiserations. They were all shocked by this sequence of events. Turkey, Israeli responses, again, very interesting. I go into the whole history of that, and also Palestinian. Some people say, well, the Palestinians were all leaping up and down for joy. Well, only some of them were, and you know, the Palestinians feel such a weight of, you know, like oppression on their shoulder that anything that seems to like strike a blow against their oppressors, they'll say, well, that's a cause for justice. It doesn't prove that they had anything to do with 9/11. But, however, some of the Al-Qaeda people that were in the planes, if you know, that's true, thought they were doing it for the sake of Palestine. The official narrative makes out that these were pro-Palestinian fanatics who were causing 9/11 in order to liberate Palestine. Well, I mean, obviously it had the total opposite effect, and it was a completely stupid thing to be doing. But anyway, I go into all that. You know, what did Yasser Arafat say? And I mean, the official diplomatic responses were all correct, like commiserations and so on. Also India, and I look at the UK, Pakistani and Chinese responses. So this is a huge amount of work. Nobody's ever done this. Nobody's ever asked these questions. I don't know why. Everybody's asleep. And then I spend a whole chapter going into every single European country, because I'm a European. I go into every single, like, what did Cyprus say? What did Estonia say? What did France? What did Holland, Belgium, France? You know, and it's very interesting what they say. They all give their commiserations and so on. I also look at Russia, what they say. Again, all correct. And even the Vatican. But the other thing I was interested in is, at what point did any of these leaders, European countries, leaders say, well, maybe the narrative you've been telling us is not 100% correct, you know? At what point, if ever, did the penny drop that there was some glaring irregularities with the narrative? So I go into that. For instance, the head of the German intelligence at the time eventually said, no, we know this was an inside job. The president of Italy at the time, who had access to all Italian intelligence, said after a while, we know this was an inside job, etc. You know, so I go into all that. And then I look at Canadian responses. Obviously, I'm Canadian. I want to know that. And in Latin America, we were just looking yesterday at a famous Latin American diplomat in the 1930s who tried to get peace.
That's right.
And he felt that there should be a bit of independence from the US in Latin America, a bit of critical distance. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't he? And so, yeah, so what did Latin America say? You know, I've asked all those questions, and all the other bits of the Commonwealth, Australia and also Africa. And then finally I end up with looking at the internal discussion in the USA. And the USA has become a fractured country over this. There's people that still believe the official narrative, and then there's an awful lot of people that no longer do. And it's led to mistrust of politicians. And we're suffering from this crisis of moral breakdown, if you want. Anyway, then there's some conclusions at the end. So this second volume, it's a kind of appendix, but is actually, I think, quite important. And nobody's written it, you know, apart from here. And of course it's unfinishable because there's always more responses. And every day I get uploads and somebody somewhere in the world comes out and says something that ought to be in volume 2. But that's why I want to set up the commission, because I can't do this work alone. This is a Herculean task, and there's only one of me, as far as I know. And I do have to sleep sometimes. So, yeah, okay, there you are. That's volume 2.
Thank you. So how will the setting up of this commission work? How will the commission itself work? How will you set it up? In what way?
Well, like I said, I want one properly trained professional historian from each country to come forward, to volunteer, to be nominated. You know, if you know in your country and you're watching this, someone who's professor of history at the University of Utrecht, or someone who's written about contemporary issues in 9/11, then please send me an email, get me in touch, and I would like to put that person on the commission. They have to be like objective, properly qualified, at least a PhD in history, preferably in 20th century history.
And what are your qualifications to set this up?
Thank you. That's
yeah.
No, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, I've spent years and years studying history. I'm a world historian. I'm partly North American, partly European. I love New York. I really took personally this attack on. I regard it as my city. Yeah, I mean, as well as all the other cities I love. But I've spent hours in Columbia University Library. You know, it's a beautiful, amazing city, New York, if you've not been there. And whoever did this attack, I, on behalf of New Yorkers, want to find out. And I know I have many dear friends who are living in and around New York. My institute has a New York coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
So my first qualification is love, because I passionately love truth. And, that's why I bothered to spend years studying history. As a, professional historian, I studied at the University of London, and then I did a PhD in history, specifically on contemporary history, which I finished. The PhD actually stops on 9/11. I looked at the history of conflict, particularly religious conflict, up to 9/11, and then it was finished. It gave me a convenient time break, sort of marker.
And now you started.
Well, then this is the post 9/11 kind of history, which I didn't put in the PhD.
Oh.
So I think all my life as a historian has been preparatory to this work, and the launching of the commission.
Mm-hmm.
And truth is precious. It's like it's as precious as oxygen. The human soul cannot live without truth. That's what kills us. We can live without food, but truth, we die, I think. And that's what's happening to the planet. That's why I'm so concerned to do this. Okay.
Okay. And how do you think you can share it objectively? Do you think you are biased in some ways?
All my professional training as a historian is to counter the biases. I've been biased, I suppose, in a certain sense, towards the love of my country. I'm a UK patriot. I love my country, and I've always believed it's a fair, just, and moral society at base. That's why I did meetings in Parliament and so on, and why I bothered to, work within the official system. So I'm biased to the belief that there is a good at the heart of power, and that we as historians have a duty to work and summon that energy. I'm biased in favour of love, that there is an answering echo. I'm biased in the hope that the people of the world believe enough in goodness and love to want to know the truth. Sometimes truth is difficult, It's like the Germans after World War II, and they discovered the Holocaust, what had been done in their name, and they discovered that their uncle Fritz had been, working in Auschwitz. This was difficult. If we discover that some of our intelligence operatives knew about 9/11, planned it, maybe UK, US collusion, Saudi, Israeli, who knows, that's going to come as a blow to us, because it will dent our patriotism. But I think we have to be mature enough to face the facts, face the truth, and each country, if we have been involved with it, need to have the moral courage to look at that, just as the Germans did at the end of World War II, or the Soviets had to do when Stalin fell and Khrushchev exposed the crimes of Stalin. That was horrendous for Russians to realise that the woman on the corridor there had been shopping people to the Gulag for 20 years. We have to face it, and we have the moral courage.
Mm-hmm.
But I am
some
biased.
Kind of truth and reconciliation.
Well, that's what it's about, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I am biased towards truth. Now, if you call that a bias, there are some philosophers and historians who say that truth doesn't exist. There's a whole fashion out there in so-called postmodernist circles who would say I'm a naive romantic to still believe in truth. They now talk about post-truth society.
Yeah.
I oppose this vehemently. I'm very old school when it comes to history and philosophy. I believe in objective truth still. And I think all that rhetoric is so much spume and spray of fake tsunamis of ignorance. That post-truth nonsense. We are pre-truth here. We haven't yet found the truth about 9/11. And so I'm biased towards the fact that truth can be found.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm biased towards the fact that truth will help heal the planet. American society, British, all of us. And so I'm like a doctor in a hospital. I'm biased towards healing the patients. Now, some doctors might say that's very old-fashioned, just let them die, and why be so romantic, and why intervene? Well, no, I am biased towards healing, but I regard that as a good bias.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think I'm able and willing to chair such a commission. Yeah.
Let me see. How do you think this commission will make a difference, or how will it contribute, and what power will it have?
Okay, so that's a big question, because people will say, well, you have, you can set up a commission and so on, but it has no power. I believe in the power of the pen. The power of the pen is mightier than the sword. The power of the intellectual is ultimately more powerful than the warrior. That's why I'm interested in the Druid tradition. That was the intellectuals and not the warrior tradition. The planet has been taken over by warriors, kidnapped. And whoever did 9/11 was a bunch of secret covert warriors, intelligence operatives. Well, we only have the power of truth. But as Gandhi pointed out, and all the great sages of history, truth is ultimately the only thing that lasts. It's called Dharma in Hindu or Buddhist dialogue. And, for instance, Buddha taught about this. He had nothing. He had one begging bowl and bare feet. And yet he changed Asia. He changed the world. And so this is a Dharma project. We have no outer power, but then we don't want or need outer power, because it's too much. The people who did 9/11 are the outer power people. This is an inner power project for moral advancement of the planet. And as to, does it have any real power? Well, they say of Buddha that his body is gone. You can't find, apparently there's bits of tooth here and there, but mostly Buddha's body is gone. But his Dharmakaya still lives on. That's his Dharmic body. So the truth content of each one of us lives on, what we do. So this is a powerful project in Dharmic terms. And everyone that loves truth around the planet, from whatever religion or spiritual path, should support and get involved.
We have already mentioned ethics before, and will the book and the commission, will they address also ethical questions? And from a perspective of philosophy, how do you look at the events?
Well, that's an important question, and yes, philosophy is the love of wisdom, which is the love of Dharma, the love of truth, and so it is huge issue, and that's why the book is called Towards a Prolegomena, and it's a historical and philosophical study of 9/11. I think the world is suffering from a collapse of ethics at the moment. If I was Kant, come back to life, I would be appalled at what's going on. People are lying. People are being dishonest in politics, and whoever did 9/11 has been lying about it ever since. I think it's shocking, and trying to hoodwink the world into a fake truth. So yes, it's hugely important for ethics, and then there's a sequence of other ethical crimes that are going on as we speak, which I think are part of the same team. Whoever planned 9/11 and executed it. And I think, as I say, it's a bunch of rogue intelligence operatives. Then they're still doing their crimes. And I would say, for instance, I just want to mention one thing that was brought to my mind today. Something I felt terrible about was the death of Khashoggi, who was a Saudi journalist and philosopher. He was a kind of ethical thinker, a Muslim, but trying to find the path, And he had his fiancée who was Turkish. He goes into the embassy in Turkey to get a permission to marry. Just think of the horribleness of this, right? And then he's captured by a hit squad sent from Saudi Arabia and literally cut up with a bone sword, killed. And today has just emerged a tape recording of his last few moments. And he's discussing this, telling him how he's going to be killed, And he says, his last words apparently were, "Don't cover my face, I've got asthma. I might have an attack." And then they drugged him so that he lost consciousness and died, and then they proceeded to dismember him. Now this has just emerged today in the world press. The UN report also included some of this evidence, and it is now, I think, 100% certain that the current ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, this 33-year-old prince, ordered that killing and knew about it. And so the covering up of that and the pretending, no, I didn't know, is what I'm talking about, this accumulation of lies. I think if people commit crimes at that level, they should face, the consequences karmically, and not hide behind power and misuse it. And 9/11 is just another example of people of great power, because whoever planned this and executed it had enormous power and wealth.
Mm-hmm.
All the evidence points, as far as I can see, and I'm speaking objectively, that some of the powers, seem to maybe have been in collusion with elements in Saudi Arabia. Maybe some rogue intelligence groups were behind this, who were secretly, following what bin Laden was doing and kind of working in collusion. We don't know, but our commission will find out. And then I would also say that whoever's behind Brexit, you see, this is another ethical issue. Again, it's to do with the suppression of truth. Lies were said during the referendum, and lies have been going on ever since. And the people are now, their parliament's been shut down, so we can't even talk about it by the forces that want Brexit. Well, it's very interesting. If you join the dots and you look at who wants Brexit and who paid for it, again, some of the people that wanted or did 9/11 seem to be implicated. And one of the reasons that Brexit has been pushed forward with such indecent haste, in my opinion, is that the European Union was trying to ban arms sales to Saudi Arabia to be used against, for war crimes in Yemen, whereas British companies want to go on doing that. So these are ethical issues, and because I stand for peace and morality in international affairs, I don't think that countries should pursue their naked self-interest, come what may, regardless of the ethical impacts. And so for the UK to act unethically, I think is and to adopt a sort of anti-EU posture over that, I think just exposes the moral poverty of the people that are doing that. So that's, and there are other ethical problems going on the planet that we should be focusing on. Issues to do with environment and human rights and so on. They're all joined up, and as a philosopher of peace. But 9/11 is a huge issue. It's like, if we're running a hotel, it's when the kitchen exploded. And therefore we need to find out who did it, because we don't want it happening ever again.
No. And lastly, how can people get involved, and where will the first meeting be, and what can people do, practically speaking?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Well, the plan is, I'm announcing this commission today on the anniversary, right? Mm-hmm. So people can know this is being done as of today, a live project. You can read the book, you can study it. You can contact me if you know a professor of history, or you are a professor of history, or a qualified historian who feels as passionately about this issue as I do. Mm-hmm. Preferably you have an open mind, you haven't already made your mind up. Yes, it was, Martians trying to take over the planet, because yes, there are some people that say that. Okay, so no, contact me, let's work. And what I would like to do is 1 year from today, on the 11th of September in 2020, I'd like to have our first open commission meeting. Right. And I intend to have that in The Hague, in Holland, because that's the seat of the International Court of Justice. Mm-hmm. It's where the Peace Palace Library is. It's where the Great Hague Peace Conventions took place. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good place, because Holland has stood for morality in international relations, historically. And I actually have had some correspondence with, people in Holland about this.
Great.
And there are some very good international historians and lawyers there. So yes, a year from this day, hopefully we'll meet for our first hearing in The Hague. So keep in touch and watch this space. Yeah. And they can contact me through my website, which is www.educationaid.net, which is like the charitable arm of my institute. And
maybe we can post the link of the website and the name of the book under the video.
We will do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, well let's end with like maybe just a minute's silence about the people that died there in that beautiful city of New York, which was founded by Dutch
New
pioneers,
Amsterdam.
wasn't it? It was called New Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And they had it for like 60 years, didn't they? Before the Duke of York captured it off you. Sorry about that. He was in turn chased out by a Dutchman from the throne in England, which is ironic.
That's ironic.
So I think it's time to let King William and King James make peace and get to the truth of what happened in this beautiful city. Okay? And Washington and all the rest. Let's finish with a couple of minutes silence and then...